Hey everyone, welcome back to the Middlegame series. I know it's been a while, and this one has been requested quite a bit, so today we're going to be covering the concept of prophylaxis. And I know this is the Middlegame series, but we're actually going to introduce this concept by looking at a position that you get out of an opening, out of the Sicilian, and I think this is just a great way to sort of show you this idea of preventing your opponent's moves. That's what prophylaxis means. It means making a move that doesn't necessarily make some kind of a threat against your opponent, but it prevents them from making threats against you. So just to show you how we got there, in case you're not familiar with the Sicilian, white plays e4, we respond with the move c5, and after a few more moves, immediately striking at the center, we exchange pawns in the center, and now we are in a particular variation of the Sicilian called the Taimanov. It's an open Sicilian, and from here there are quite a few ways that black can continue. The way that I like to play it is by making a prophylactic move that looks a little bit passive when you're first looking at it, and that's the move a6. Why is this a good move? Well, it's because it's controlling this very important b5 square, which if we don't make this move, there are a few options that white has to sort of infiltrate our position quite early before we've had a chance to develop too many of our pieces. You'll notice that a lot of our pieces are still on the back rank. And you'll often hear that it's not great to be pushing your pawns at the beginning of the game at the cost of developing your pieces. That's generally good information and you should stick to it, but if you know what you're doing here, this a6 move is actually worth the tempo that you're sort of losing by not developing pieces here. Why is that? You'll see that white already has 3 minor pieces aimed at this b5 square. So this is very simply just a move to prevent white from coming in with those pieces. There's threats of perhaps pinning the knight to the king. There's threats of if we want to move our queen up here, which is a pretty common move in this line of the Sicilian, bringing one of these knights down, making our queen move again. It might not necessarily happen right away, but that is one of white's long-term goals, is to start infiltrating on this side of the board. So if we can stop them from doing that, take away this square for their minor pieces, that just slows white's attack down, and we would love to do that as black. And by the way, if you do play the Sicilian and you don't play this move, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's maybe a slower way to play the Sicilian, and there's so many ways to play the Sicilian, it's really up to you. But I just think this is a great example of showing you what exactly a prophylactic move typically looks like. All right, now let's get into our main middle game examples. In this position, black has just played the move rook to c8. Now, if you've been watching my speedrun videos, you'll know that there is a question that you should be asking yourself every time your opponent makes a move, and that question is, what does that move do? That question is also a good starting point for thinking more prophylactically. So there are a couple key ideas that I will note about what this move does. One thing is, if this pawn wasn't here, our queen would be under attack right now. So often if you have a long-range piece that is aimed at one of your important pieces, your queen, your king, sometimes if like a bishop is aimed at a rook, things like that, that's something to keep an eye on. That probably means that your opponent has some sneaky ideas. So that's one thing this move does. What does it do? It's aiming at our queen, and it's getting on an open file. That's generally just a good place for the rook to go. Sometimes getting on an open file is that's the end of it. That's your opponent's whole idea, and it'll just be good as the game continues. But in this case, because we have an important piece lined up with our opponent's rook, it's probably worth taking a little bit of a closer look at it. So remember, one of the first things that I noted was that this rook would be attacking our queen if this pawn on c3 was not there. So working a little bit backwards, is there any way that this pawn would ever go away? Well, this pawn is defending our knight on d4. Okay, working backwards even more, is there any piece that's attacking our knight on d4? The rook, the other rook. So okay, if this rook takes this knight and we take back, now suddenly this pawn is gone and our queen is under attack. So that's the sort of stepping backwards that you have to do to see what your opponent's threats might be. It's really just logical thinking. And this particular idea is sort of the pinned pawns don't protect saying that you might have heard. Because this pawn is technically pinned to our queen, it can't take back because then we will lose the queen. So what can we do about that? Well, great idea might be to just move the queen, because then we will no longer be facing this threat of rook takes knight and pawn takes and rook takes queen. Another maybe mistaken way of thinking about this is a little bit too far back. Okay, maybe let's prevent this rook on a4 from even attacking the knight on d4. So some players might think, okay, let's just push b4. Well, suddenly we're dropping pawns over here because once this pawn pushes forward, then it's no longer protecting the a pawn, and we're still losing material. Not quite as much as we would have, but in this case, like I said, it's just easier to move the queen. So even just queen d2 looks like a pretty passive move. We're not really threatening anything, but we're getting out of the threats that our opponent is making against us. This is how you think prophylactically. So now moving into our next position, it's actually pretty similar to the previous position because if you'll notice, there are pieces, long-range pieces, that are lined up with only one pawn in between them. And if that's not enough of a hint, I'll point you to the c-file. So these rooks on the c-file are currently looking at each other, meaning if this pawn wasn't in the way, and if it was white to move, a lot of ifs, I know, but we would be getting back rank checkmated because the rook would take rook and we've got nothing else to take back with. You may have heard the saying that loose pieces fall off. And so this is often why it's good to not separate your rooks. Your rooks do a really nice job of defending each other. So they should really only be separated if you've got a specific plan that's going to go pretty quickly for both of them. Or if you are just taking one move in an attempt to double them up on the same file, that's usually a good idea. But in this case, just leaving this one lonely rook on its back rank for a long time gives white a lot of tactical ideas, right? So white has just made the move queen to e3, and we can ask ourselves the question, what does this move do? Well, at first it doesn't really seem to be doing anything. The only piece of ours that this queen is really looking at is the bishop, which, this wouldn't even really set off alarm bells for a lot of chess players because the pawn is just protecting the bishop, and usually queen takes bishop is not a great trade. But in this case, as we've learned from the previous example, this would then move this pawn out of the way and our rook would be taken on the next move. Another threat to look at in this position is that the queen and the rook are now lined up on the same file. So if we were to connect our rooks in the wrong way, maybe by going to c7, we're also just getting mated. Queen e8 check, and after queen d8, it's over. So the better moves in this position are just ideas to prevent that whole idea from ever occurring. So we can do this in a few ways. We can simply move the bishop back so the queen can no longer take. We can move this rook so it is more protected, maybe by going to the F file, joining up with the rest of the cannon we've created over here. We can also just give our king some breathing room by playing the move a6, which, this doesn't work anymore because our king, even though we're losing pieces, our opponent has lost the queen for a rook and a minor piece, and our king gets to escape, so it's totally fine. So again, just asking ourselves, what does that move do? Even if it looks like a crazy move, a crazy capture, we got to look at all of the threats, all of the forcing moves that our opponent could make. And don't leave your pieces hanging for too long. All right, and we have our final example today. This one, we have the white pieces, and it's a little bit more complex, not quite as common as the pinned pawn situation that we've been looking at, but black has just made the move knight to g6. So we can ask ourselves, what does this move do? And another way to think about this, especially with tricky pieces like knights, is where are all the squares that this piece could possibly go? So it's usually best to move forward. So moving forward for black would look something like this move or this move. And out of the two, I would say putting the knight on the rim is typically grim. So I'm going to go with the more plausible move, which is knight to f4. This puts the knight on an outpost square. It's sort of embedded itself into our half of the board, and it's also starting to create some threats if you look at the position a little bit closer. So let's do some visualization. Imagining the knight is on f4. What can that move do from there? Well, that knight would be looking at the square h3. It's also looking at a bunch of other squares, but let's focus on this one for now because the black rook is also attacking that square and that pawn. So if black had a bunch of moves in a row where we couldn't do anything, they would probably play knight to f4, followed by rook takes on h3, and then after our king moves, because our king would be in check, they could take our bishop over here on c3. So sort of out of nowhere, our h3 pawn is sort of coming under attack here. So working backwards, going back to the very beginning of this sequence, we would just like to prevent black's knight from getting here in the first place. And there's a few ways that we can do that. We have the pieces that will stop the knight from going there, capture it if it does decide to go there. And those 2 pieces are, of course, our minor pieces because we wouldn't want to give up a rook for a knight. It's not that serious at this point. So we can just use our minor pieces. It's on a dark square. We've got a dark squared bishop, so we can just move the bishop back to d2. The other way we can do this is by moving our knight to d3, which of course also covers this square. Now often you'll hear that bishops are a little bit better than knights, and you usually don't want to trade off a bishop for a knight, but in this case I will say that at least on this side of the board, the pawns are pretty shut down, and our bishop really doesn't have that big of a range of motion. So if we were to go here and the knight went to f4, we'd be pretty happy to snap it off, and if it happened right away, we'd win a pawn in the meantime. So it's a little bit technical, but I'd probably prefer the bishop move over the knight move. I'd actually like to keep the knight exactly where it's at. It's on a really nice outpost square. There's no kicking that knight out anytime soon. Our opponent doesn't have a dark squared bishop to kick it out, and the knight is a little bit too far away now. So I'd rather give up our bishop than our super great knight. And this position is actually inspired by a position that I got in an online game, and I didn't make the right move. I was not able to prevent this knight from coming forward because I didn't even see that threat in the first place. It was a slightly different position, but same general idea. And so I think, again, just asking yourself the question, every time your opponent makes a move, what does that move do? And thinking even a few steps in advance. If you see a potentially threatening move, a potential threat might just be to move a piece onto your half of the board, which just is inviting tactics for your opponent. So if you can prevent that at all costs, that's where the prophylaxis comes in. If you're interested in learning more about things like logical reasoning and data analysis, I'd like to introduce you to the sponsor of today's video, Brilliant.org. Brilliant is the best way to learn things like math, data science, and computer science interactively. Marv does not want the center. Okay, so Marv can't be here or here, so Marv has to go on the window. They have thousands of lessons covering basic to advanced topics. Ty does not want the aisle, so Ty has to go in the center and Loy has to go in the aisle. Boom. Plus, everything is super fun and customizable to fit your needs and lets you work at your own pace. Neither Nuck nor Mig is next to the empty... See, how? Wait, do I switch these 2 around? Oh, okay. You can try Brilliant free for 30 days at brilliant.org/Kamryn. The first 200 signups will get 20% off their annual premium subscription. That's brilliant.org/Kamryn. Thanks again to Brilliant for sponsoring today's video. Thanks so much for watching. If you like this video, please be sure to subscribe and also let me know what other middle game concepts you'd like to see in future videos. I'll see you soon.